I remember the day it all began, when my 15-year-old son, Ryan, asked if he could start spending weekends at my sister Lisa's house. It wasn't an odd request. Lisa and her husband, Mark, had always been kind to Ryan, treating him like their own. They didn't have children of their own, and they'd been more like second parents to him ever since he was a baby. Their house was spacious and peaceful, and Lisa was the type of aunt who made everything seem funner, whether it was cooking, playing games, or just hanging out. At first, I saw no harm in it. He wanted to stay at their place over the weekend, relax, and enjoy a change of environment. I figured it would give him some independence, a little bit of freedom to explore his adolescence, which is something I couldn't always give him. He didn't have many friends, so having time with family seemed like a good substitute. I told myself it was healthy for him. I thought it was good that he had strong relationships with extended family, and he seemed so eager about it that I couldn't bring myself to say no. Ryan was a quiet kid, always had been. When he came back from his weekends at Lisa's, he never said much, just vague things like, "It was good," or "We watched a movie." The typical teenage answers. He wasn't a talker, but I chalked it up to him growing up, needing his own space, and figuring out who he was. At that age, kids pull away from their parents. It's natural. But after a few weeks, something started gnawing at me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something wasn't right. It started with small things. He seemed different when he got home, more distant, more distracted. His eyes didn't meet mine as easily, and he always seemed to be carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. His body language was closed off, his posture slouched, his responses even shorter than usual. He'd head straight to his room after we got home, and sometimes I could hear him pacing or lying awake at night. I wanted to believe it was just teenage angst, but the mother inside me sensed something more. The weekends at Lisa's became more frequent. It wasn't just every now and then anymore, it became every single weekend. When I mentioned that maybe he didn't have to go so often, he brushed me off, saying that he enjoyed being there and that it was better than being bored at home. I wanted to believe him, but the worry in my stomach only grew. The odd part was, it wasn't like he was particularly close to his cousins. Elisa and Mark didn't have any kids. So why was he so eager to go? Why did he rush to their house every weekend as if it was some kind of escape? I wanted to ask him, but I feared sounding paranoid or overprotective. Lisa was my sister, after all, and I trusted her. I couldn't imagine her doing anything to make me question that trust. And Mark? He was a good man. I'd known him for years, and he'd always been nothing but kind to us both. Yet, something kept tugging at me, that familiar feeling in my gut that mothers get when they know something is off. I started thinking about dropping by Lisa's house unannounced, just to see what was going on. But every time I entertained the idea, I felt guilty. It would seem intrusive, suspicious even. And what if it was all in my head? What if Ryan was just a teenager trying to carve out his own life, and I was the one projecting my own insecurities onto him? But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only grew stronger. One Saturday, after Ryan had left for another weekend at Lisa's, I couldn't shake the anxiety. I tried distracting myself, telling myself I was being irrational, that there was nothing to worry about. But by mid-morning, I found myself grabbing my car keys, heading out the door, and driving toward my sister's house. My mind was racing the entire way, torn between wanting to know the truth and dreading what I might find. When I pulled up to their house, everything looked normal. The house was quiet, their car parked in the driveway. I rang the doorbell, and after a moment, Lisa answered, looking a bit surprised to see me but smiling warmly as usual. "Hey," she said, her voice cheerful. "What are you doing here?" I forced a smile in return. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. "Is Ryan here?" There was a slight hesitation at just a fraction of a second, but enough to catch my attention. "Yeah, he's in the garage with Mark," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "They've been working on some project all morning." My stomach tightened. I tried to act casual, but inside, I was screaming with unease. As Lisa disappeared into the kitchen to get me a drink, I wandered toward the garage door. I could hear muffled voices from the other side, the sound of tools clinking against metal. I knocked lightly, and when the door swung open, there stood Mark, wiping his hands on a rag, looking surprised to see me. "Hey, didn't know you were coming by," he said, glancing over his shoulder toward Ryan, who was crouched next to an engine block, fiddling with something. Ryan didn't look up. "Hey, Mom," he mumbled without any enthusiasm, his focus staying on the task in front of him. Mark started talking about the project they were working on, at something about rebuilding an engine. But I wasn't really listening. My eyes were on Ryan. He looked tense, uncomfortable. He wasn't acting like his usual self. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. After a few minutes, I made an excuse to leave, saying I had errands to run. Lisa waved goodbye from the kitchen, and Mark smiled as he went back to his work. But Ryan barely acknowledged me as I walked out the door. The drive home felt surreal, like I was moving through a fog. My thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion, suspicion, and fear. What was going on? Why did Ryan seem so distant? So different? Was it just a phase, or was something happening at my sister's house that I didn't know about? That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next few weekends followed the same pattern. Ryan would leave for Lisa's, come home withdrawn and distant, and I would spend the nights in a sleepless haze, tormented by my suspicions but too afraid to confront them. It wasn't until a few weeks later that everything started to unravel. It was a Sunday night, and Ryan had just come home from another weekend at Lisa's. He barely said 2 words to me before heading straight to his room. I didn't push him to talk, hoping he'd come around on his own. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at me. Something was wrong, and I needed to know what it was. After midnight, when the house was quiet, I crept down the hallway and stopped outside Ryan's room. His door was slightly ajar, and I could see the faint glow of his phone screen in the darkness. I knocked softly, but there was no response. I pushed the door open a little further, stepping inside. He was asleep, his phone